Welcome to Espresso Jams, short, concentrated, delicious conversations about business, life, and more. And now, here's your host, Joe Matz.
Hello, everyone. I'm so glad you're here today with us. Today, I have the pleasure of having John David Wagner with us. Now, John David is a financial advisor with Edward Jones, but he hasn't always been a financial advisor. He had a previous life working with large carnivores. Yes, you heard that right. Big animals that eat meat, and that's what he did. And that's what we're going to talk about. So, John David, welcome to the show, buddy.
Well, Joe, thanks so much for having me today.
It is a pleasure to have you here. This is going to be a very unique interview, I have a feeling.
I get that from time to time. Absolutely. It's not really a topic a lot of people talk about. It's not a topic that a lot of folks have experience with.
It's not a topic I could talk about, that's for sure. How did you get started working with large carnivores?
So, my degree in college is actually in fisheries and wildlife management from NC State. And so, in some ways, working in the zoo industry, working with large carnivores was more of a natural fit than what I'm doing today. I went into the zoo industry or I went into, I should say, wildlife management thinking, maybe I'd be a field biologist, something like that. But I was doing some research with a doctoral candidate at NC State who was using some really cool software to track wild bobcats. Basically, she was using what are called footprint traps, where you have some moist sand down, the bobcat steps in the sand leaves a footprint. And she had a computer program that would analyze it and tell you if that footprint was the same as another bobcat from another location. In order to calibrate it, we needed to have a known bobcat. And so we found a captive bobcat at this little zoo north of Mebane. Um, Found out about the place that way, fell in love with it, and suddenly my entire career trajectory changed.
Wow. And so where did that take you?
Well, that really took me. I started out just doing whatever I could around the zoo to help. I was feeding the animals, I was cleaning up after the animals, and really enjoyed that, but found that I had a true passion for not just caring for the animals, but also growing the business. I found that that was something I was really passionate about. And so I became more and more involved in the higher level planning of the business. I became curious about the finances, about the personnel management, about the things behind the scenes that really made the business tick. And so by the time that I left the zoo I was at, I was actually the assistant director. I was in charge of the long-term strategic planning. I was in charge of overseeing the management of the staff, the financial planning and budgeting. And so I'd become much more involved in the business as opposed to care of the animals.
And so then you were working with the animals directly, and then you moved up, and I guess you moved away from working directly with the animals as much, and you got involved with the business side. And what was that like?
Well, it was a really interesting transition, and again, not one that I never ever really thought I was going to have in my life. I went into wildlife management because I wanted to work with animals,
Hmm.
and so discovering that I had this passion for kind of the business behind it um, was certainly strange, and there were certainly pieces that were very natural fits from the wildlife management thing. Believe it or not, working with people can be a little bit like working with wildlife sometimes.
Can it
Uh,
be?
it was a lot like herding cats from time to time. And so there were certainly takeaways from working with the animals that translated well, but there was a whole new skill set that I got to learn as well, and that really fascinated me.
I imagine there are a lot of things that you can translate from working with the animals and working with the business side to what you're doing now as a financial advisor.
Absolutely. And so one of the big things I found that I was really passionate about with the business was this whole concept of risk mitigation and risk planning. And you may be saying to yourself, well, you're working with lions and tigers. Of course, there are some very obvious risks that you have to plan for, and that's true. But all businesses have a level of risk. Whether or not it's obvious is a very different story. But just at the zoo, for instance, obviously we needed to plan for what happens if something goes wrong with one of the animals in terms of what happens if an animal escapes, what happens if somebody accidentally goes in with an animal, things like that. But there were a host of other things. What happens in inclement weather? What happens if we lose power for a few days? What happens if our food supply goes dry for a few weeks? How do we prepare for these things And how do we mitigate to the best that we can? How do we have these contingency plans in place for the things that we think are, you know, likely at some point going to happen? At some point, we're going to lose power. How do we prepare for that? We hope we never have an animal escape, but how do we prepare for that? And then what's some of the crazy off the wall things that we may need to be thinking about? What happens if there's a wildfire in the area? What do we need to do in that situation? So just thinking about all these things and hoping that you never have to enact this plan, but you don't want to have to be making it up on the fly should something happen.
Right. You need that contingency planning. And I think that's so important in business also. A lot of people, they kind of fly by the seat of their pants and hoping we travel on hope it never happens. But the contingency planning, I mean, that must really come in handy to be able to think of, how you thought about that. And with animals, you've got a couple of hours, maybe days to react to a situation.
Or even in some situations, minutes.
Minutes.
And so you really don't want to be making that up. And it's the same with business owners. You hope that some of these things never happen, but what happens if they do? How does this affect your business? How does this affect your family, your friends, your employees? And every business is going to have its own unique challenges. Some of them may have licensing challenges. They have to have special permits, continuing education, things like that, and those standards may change. Some of them may have more legislative risk. What happens if legality in your industry changes? How does that impact your business? And what do you need to be thinking about there? And so, as much as I would love to say there's a one size fits all for these are the things you need to be thinking about as a business, I encourage business owners to really sit down and take a deep dive and say, what are the things that could really impact my business, whether I think they're likely or not? What are the things that may impact my business? And is there anything I can do to prepare myself for them?
Yes. Do you ever look at business owners and you say, this guy reminds me of that tiger, or this guy reminds me of the lion over there?
I don't know if I go quite to that degree, but I think there certainly are parallels where I say, man, this business owner is thinking like, this guy I knew from the zoo industry. They thought everything was going to be great until one day maybe it wasn't. Or this guy's really given a lot of thought. There was this other guy I knew from the zoo that did a great job of thinking about their contingency plans. Yeah, they're really doing a great job with that.
Yeah. Okay. Great. And
Yeah.
John David, let me ask you a question. For our listeners today, what would you say would be the one big takeaway?
The one big takeaway that I would really encourage your listeners to be thinking about, again, it's going to come down to what could go wrong. It's easy to think about all the great things that could happen to your business owner. When you're a business owner, man, everything just looks like it's great. Everything's fantastic. Everything's going to go well. I've got this great plan. I've got this great product. I've got this great idea, and I'm going to make millions on it. But sit down and think about what are the things that could come out of left field. Great example. Nobody saw COVID.
Right.
Nobody saw COVID happening. And I'm not going to say that in my contingency plans at the zoo, we had a plan for COVID, but we had a contingency plan for what happens if we don't have tours for a period of time. And I'm certain that they lost tour revenue. What happens if our food supply runs dry? Well, they probably had some challenges with food supplies. And so we may not be able to see every single detail of the future, but having these plans in place, even if they're very broad strokes, can help you land or quickly get your feet underneath you in the event that something does come out of left field. In the event that something does just come and slap you in the face, you're going to be able to kind of reorient yourself so much quicker. And again, I think COVID really kind of impressed that upon a lot of business owners in a way that maybe nothing in the recent history has.
Right. And I think if you have a plan, you can't plan for everything, but if you have a plan, it's a lot easier to modify that to the specific situation than if you're starting from zero with no plan.
100% agree. And I think one of my favorite quotes is, failing to plan is planning to fail.
Yes. Yes. And John David, how can someone get in touch with you if they want to know more and want to talk with you?
So yeah, the easiest way to get in touch with me, if you have any questions, want to follow up, I'll give you a phone number and an email address. The best phone number to reach me at is 919-568-9728. And the best email address for me is johndavid.wagner, so just my name, @edwardjones.com.
Perfect. Okay. And everyone, we've been talking with John David Wagner from Edward Jones and his experience with large carnivores. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Joe, thanks so much for having me today. Y'all have a great day.
You too. Pleasure speaking with you. Bye now.